Well, the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations is hoping the rise in First Nations voter turnout in the last election continues this time around. And he's making sure the political parties know that First Nations voters have increasing clout in many ridings in this country, and winning their support means acting on First Nations priorities. What are those priorities? Perry Bellegarde is the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. He's with me now. Chief Bellegarde, good to see you. Thanks for coming in. So what are the big priorities for First Nations communities, First Nations voters in this election? And to be clear, they match a lot of the same priorities as Canadians in general, but there are some specific demands and priorities that you have, right?
Yeah, there are, and I always say, like, they're not only First Nations priorities, they're Canada's priorities. If you make investments in education and housing, water, infrastructure, that's not only good for our people, it's good for Canada, because the gap quality of life starts to close. So we always begin with that. We always talk about some of the most important priorities coming up, and I think number one that everybody's starting to say, that's very important, not only to Canada but the world, and of that, of course, is the environment and climate change. We have to get our heads around that. And as First Nations people, we have rights, but we also have responsibilities to protect the land and water. So for a lot of our people, that's important. And so we need to see that front and center. And then from there, we start thinking about, there are other things. Too many of our people in jail. Too many of our children in foster care. So disproportionate number of our people are in jail. So looking at restorative justice issues and how can we start moving to initiatives to deal with that crisis, looking at policing as an essential services, looking at ways and means to recognize First Nations law, natural law, creators law, in addition to common law, civil law. So that becomes a very important piece going forward. Like treaty implementation, honoring the UN Declaration, moving for legislation in that regard. So the list will go on and on, right. But there are some priorities we've got to start focusing on a little bit more with focused energy.
Right, and is there is anything you've heard from the parties so far? We'll hear more during the campaign, but what have you heard so far that suggests any of the parties have those interests in mind and at the forefront?
Well, they're still rolling out their platforms. We've been, our team's been working with their teams, in the Liberals and the Conservative, NDP and the Greens to try to
You did that in the last election too, so
no question.
You've done it again this time.
We have to. That's our job as the AFN, is to influence party platforms, to advocate for policy and legislative change, to respect title and jurisdiction, to respect Aboriginal rights and treaty rights, and find ways not only respect them, but honor and implement them. So that's our job going forward. So we're meeting with their teams. They've yet to formalize and unroll their platforms, but that's our focus.
I guess, what role do you see First Nations communities, people, leaders playing in the climate change process? I think a lot of this has to do with environmental reviews and the role that the input you get to have in plans to fight climate change, and that includes plans for big energy projects and so on. What more do you want to see done in terms of the role that First Nations play?
Well, it's not only getting involved in the assessment, in the review of major projects across Canada. That's one piece. Utilizing elders' traditional knowledge, locally, regionally, nationally, internationally, is very key. That's number two things. Three things is looking at First Nations that are really energy efficient already, like the Souk First Nation in British Columbia. Chief Planis, like, they're totally solar. Looking at Gull Bay First Nation, Chief King, they have solar microgrids up there in Northern Ontario, and they're getting off of diesel. So, like, there are certain things at the local level that can happen, and there are models out there that can happen. So there's 3 points to keep in mind as you go forward on this. So
but right, in terms of the role in the process, I know that one of the concerns is the role of First Nations in the process, in the environmental process. And we're seeing the Trans Mountain process pipeline expansion go ahead. We're seeing more First Nations now going back to court to try and block this. And I guess the question becomes, what has to change in that process? Because there's already this legal duty to consult, but it doesn't always end up the way First Nations people want it to.
No, I think the simple point is you have to have First Nations involved sooner than later on any major project. And I think the word is sustainable economic development. I think the words are finding balance between the environment and the economy. I think the focus has to be creating space for the dialogue to respect title and jurisdiction and rights. And one of the most important rights to respect is the right to self-determination, which is the right to say yes and or the right to say no to any particular project. And that has to be involved. So it's getting back to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and embrace free, prior, and informed consent. And I think that's the roadmap to reconciliation. And I think all levels of government, federal and provincial, and as well as industry, need to embrace that and build a respectful relationship with First Nations first before you try to build anything. And that's, to me, is the key to economic certainty.
But some First Nations want the expansion, some don't. And so the question, so is duty to consult just to consult, or does that mean, in your view, that if a First Nations community doesn't want the pipeline expansion going through their area, then that's it?
It's a duty to consult and accommodate, and pipeline's going to have bigger impacts on First Nations across the line. Some have greater impacts. So you have to look at each individual case scenario by scenario. My point, again, is to respect the right to self-determination. The rights and title holders will make that determination going forward. So we've got lots of work to do.
Okay. The Liberal government promised to repair the relationship with First Nations in this country. So I'm just trying to get a sense from you as we head into this election now, where we are with that promise. Has the government lived up to its promise to repair the relationship?
Well, again, over 500 years of colonization and oppression, you're not going to get done in 4 years. There's no way you're going to get it done in 4 years. Is there momentum? Of course there is. There's been $21.4 billion over 7 fiscal years to deal with the socioeconomic gap. That's unprecedented. That's 4 Kelowna Accords. So that's a positive movement. I see movement on C91, on languages revitalization. I see movement on C92, dealing with 40,000 children in foster care and provincial care systems. So I see movement, but progress doesn't mean parity. So we still have more work to do in the area of health, rights to health care, infrastructure. There's still ice roads, there's still broadband necessities, there's still overcrowded housing, so there's still more work to do.
So when you talk about momentum, are you endorsing any one particular party? Are you suggesting there's a way First Nations people could vote to keep the momentum, or if they vote a certain way, it might lose the momentum? Or are you just saying that we just want people to vote, and are you telling them how they should vote?
No, I'm saying get out to vote. Yeah. And we had 61.5% of eligible voters vote last time from First Nations people, which is good. I'm saying get out and vote, make an informed decision. Look at all the party platforms. Look what's happened in the last 4 years. Which party is more likely to move ahead on our issues than other parties, and who are making strong statements regarding restorative justice, regarding proper health care, regarding infrastructure, regarding rights implementation, or even recognition of Aboriginal rights and title? Who's making those strong statements? And make an informed decision. Put your X or your check mark where that resonates with you.
The relationship with governments and all governments, I think, First Nations and governments, seem to be marked in somewhat by confrontation, but really by a lot of court battles. And we've just seen another one where the government's been ordered to pay compensation to children and their families that were involved in on-care welfare, on-reserve welfare systems that didn't work for them, that weren't operated properly. And I guess I'm wondering, how does ultimately the relationship get repaired if, at a fundamental level, two sides continue to fight a lot in court?
Well, as First Nations people, Indigenous people, as we say, we have to use every tool we have in our toolbox to bring about policy and legislative change. We have to do everything at our disposal to fight for recognition of rights and title and jurisdiction and for the same quality of life as everybody else in Canada. And so we've utilized the court system, and we're winning numerous Supreme Court decisions regarding Aboriginal rights and title. I think of the Chilcotin decision.
I guess that's kind of what I'm asking. Do you get tired of governments taking you to court on these fundamental issues?
Of course we do. So why don't we quit wasting taxpayers' money? Let's quit wasting time, energy, and money in a court system that is foreign in a lot of cases, and start sitting down at those processes and tables to move beyond the Indian Act and start looking towards rights recognition and First Nations jurisdiction and title and sovereignty as well, and set up those tables for that. You're going to save a lot of time, energy, and money doing that. And then that's the process and plan we have to go forward with. The Crown, you have the honor of the Crown, the duty of the Crown, federal fiduciary trust obligations to First Nations people. You have treaty obligations. Let's set up the processes that's not so adversarial like a court system and sit down and talk and work these way through for proper implementation.
If I'm not mistaken, I think you voted for the first time yourself in the last
In 2015,
in 2015
yes.
for the first time. And I guess let's leave our conversation on that note. What, in terms of the value of that process and why you decided to do it, and presumably you're going to do it again.
Yes.
And so what's your message to other First Nations people who may think, there's no reason to vote? What path have you followed now in the last 4 years?
I say the message is this: embrace the concept of dual citizenship. I'm a member of Little Black Bear First Nation. I'm a member of the Cree Nation. And I speak Cree. I don't feel any less Cree for voting, and I don't feel any member of Little Black Bears First Nation because I voted. I'm also a Canadian citizen, and I have that fundamental right to vote. And let me tell you, by voting, if you're a member of Parliament or you're trying to be a member of Parliament, and you know that First Nations don't vote, do you really care about our issues, our concerns, our priorities? Oh, First Nations don't vote anyway. Never mind them. But now, as a member of Parliament, you're seeing that First Nations vote. We better start paying attention. And so that seems to be resonating now. So that would be my message to First Nation citizens. Embrace the concept of dual citizenship. And let's really rock the vote again on October 21 and get out. And instead of 61.5% of eligible voters, kick that number higher. Because our issues and priorities matter. Our vote matters. And if you want to be Prime Minister of Canada, you better listen to First Nations issues. And that way as well, you're going to build a better country together.
Perry Bellegarde, always good to talk to you. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Peter.